At the posh restaurant where I had to dress for my sister's promotion, the people there acted as if they hadn't ghosted me for 5 years in a row. I sat there, my fork poised like a weapon, knowing full well what was about to happen. As dessert and the second round of drinks arrived, my father raised his glass and declared, loud enough for the whole damn room to hear, to those who serve with honor and those who just serve their egos. As I swallowed my pride like dry bread, I overheard my sister smirking and my mother looking away as we all became silent, as if to say, "You're not one of us anymore." Soon after, the door swung open, and a man of imposing stature and a commanding presence strode in. He ignored my father and sister, instead approaching me directly and proclaimed, "General Strickland, ma'am, welcome back." Embarrassment washed over everyone. My father shook my sister's hand, and she seemed to have swallowed her promotion whole. They had already written me off, erased my name, and fed me rumors and silence. But guess what? I returned with the truth and a witness. You would think I'd finished by now. Hey there, I'm Lena Strickland, and I haven't even begun yet. My family has used me as a source of pride, embarrassment, and now an inerasable reminder. If you want to hear more, you may leave a comment or tell me. No matter where you're from, it means the world to me that this is reaching someone. If this story hits you hard, please subscribe so that more stories like this may be told. Thank you. Be comfortable, because I'm about to spill the beans. When I returned home that autumn, it wasn't with the acclaim of a returning soldier or the embrace of a long-lost sister. It was just me. Lena Strickland strode up the driveway like a ghost who had never left a forwarding address. No one had ever inquired as to my whereabouts. Instead, they had assumed that I had left the army, the war, and all attempts at reconciliation. I allowed them to assume this because no one in this household had the guts to acknowledge my father's decision to host a modest Veterans Day celebration, just a backyard potluck, with a few neighbors who had served in uniform in the past. The music, you'd think my sister had invaded Normandy from the way she gleamed in her ironed National Guard uniform, combat boots, shiny medals, and well-sculpted stance. She hadn't been in 4 years. I received an invitation in the form of an email courtesy copy, but when I showed there, no one even noticed that I was there. "Excuse me, honey, but that area is already taken by Lieutenant Strickland." My Aunt Rachel pointed to a folding chair beside the water fountain. She waved to the distant corner, and I nodded in her direction before making my way to the spare table, the one used for unexpected visitors and forgotten salads. A large photo exhibit had been arranged by Mom, Dad, and Grandfather during World War II and Vietnam, respectively. There was a family portrait from Christmas years ago in place of my West Point commissioning photo. There was no uniform and no indication of my identity. I stood there for a whole minute before I realized something was amiss or that someone was missing. I asked my mom in a casual manner, "Where's the old picture of me in uniform?" It was getting old, so I thought we'd use something newer. But she still didn't look up from the tray of devil's eggs. Instead, she stared past me as if I were a shadow on the tablecloth. When a cousin later wanted to know what I was up to, my cousin Melody laughed and told me that she had been a consultant before. However, now that she's presumably receiving her retirement benefits at home, someone on the other end of the line joined in, saying something along the lines of, "Office jobs are safer anyway than doing nothing." The laughing that followed was casual rather than nasty, and I sneaked away to get some water when I heard a low, grumbling voice catch me. "Strickland, Lena." I turned to see a retired colonel. I couldn't place him, but his posture gave him away. "I believe I saw your name on the Langy Tigre directive. It was a hell of a plan." I smiled a little too quickly. He paused, studying me maybe, but it saved lives. Then he nodded respectfully. "Well, I guess not everyone got credit for that." Yes, I did mention that, but the goal wasn't to give him credit. He didn't feel compelled to elaborate. The room seemed otherwise uninterested in remembering, but that one glance was enough to bring me back down to earth. Reminiscing about that fateful night in the war room, I found myself in a predicament. 12 Allied units were waiting for my command, but my gut told me to hold. The enemy artillery missed us by minutes, and I took the fall to protect my unit. Unfortunately, my name was scrubbed from the after-action reports, but those brave men and women were able to return home. It was a cost and an honor. Someone filled my cup without asking on the table where there were named tumblers and music. I went back to my plastic chair near the patio corner. For Dad, Uncle Mike, and myself, we drank from an anonymous white plastic cup without a label or name. But I thought, sometimes honor doesn't need a nameplate, but if someone dares to speak it aloud, don't stop them. I padded into the living room, where an old display cabinet sat like a shrine devoted not to faith, but to legacy, the morning after the Veterans Day gathering. The scent of leftover brisket lingered in the kitchen, faint but persistent, like memories you wish would fade, but never quite do. I wasn't expecting to see my face amid my father's medals, my grandfather's faded black and white portrait, and Melody's immaculate National Guard graduation certificate all neatly displayed on the wall. However, a small part of me still peered. I sat on my heels and stared at my West Point graduation frame for a long minute. It was still intact and recognizable, but the photo inside was gone. Instead of throwing it away, which would have been too direct, my mom shelved it like a seasonal decoration, gently removing it like a faint square of lighter wood. Old habits die hard. "When did you remove my picture from the cabinet?" she said as she poured herself a cup of tea that no longer suited the space. I discovered her in the kitchen later that morning. At dinner that night, Melody was all smiles as she spoke about her upcoming promotion ceremony. She had reserved a private dining room at a military officer's restaurant outside the base, and there was a wall of honor there. Her eyes were bright as she said, "They put your photo up for the week if you're being recognized." Mom gently clapped her hands, and Melody continued, "That sounds lovely, dear Lena." She looked at me and said, "If you're coming, wear something simple, nothing too attention-grabbing." I attempted to smile, but I didn't want to steal the show. I didn't say it aloud, but I once briefed senior command in a combat zone while wearing full-dress blues and body armor. It was a little too loud for Mom that night. I was folding laundry in the guest room when my phone buzzed, just a number, and I didn't recognize the message. They were digging into Lang Tigra. Be cautious because some journalists have old files that include your name. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity after it went dark, and the name Langi Tyre hadn't crossed my lips in years. It was the mission that ended my career, the one for which I took the fall, and I buried it so deeply that its echo no longer resounded. Now I'm back in the living room, and the frame is still on the table, propped up by nothing but the empty shell of a photo. I reached out and touched the empty border, letting my fingers trace the space where I once belonged. I wondered how many memories had been a part of, only to have them erased later on because they didn't fit the narrative of pride and polish. Even though the photo didn't make the cut, the frame remained. The promotion ceremony took place at a military dining hall close to Virginia Beach. The walls were adorned with portraits of severe generals and polished steel flags. I arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in a long wool coat and a charcoal black dress. My outfit was simple, practical, and elegant. It allowed me to blend in or stand out depending on my posture. I presented my invitation to the officer at the check-in table, and he examined the list, looked at my face, and asked, "And you're a guest of?" With a perfectly placed smile, Melody swooped in before I could respond. "She's family," she informed the officer. "She used to be an admin support or something. She's just here for me." I didn't flinch. I was trained not to, she said, as she offered me a side hug that hardly touched my shoulder. Melody, a radiant, bright-eyed, confident golden child in olive drab, stepped confidently to the podium. She began by saying, "When I was a kid, my sister once told me, 'You go ahead and try. I don't think I can keep up with you.'" The room was decorated with red, white, and blue bunting, and there was a long table of seated officers and their families. I sat off to the side, with no name tag, introduction, but with a half-empty glass of water and a folded napkin. That was the turning point when I resolved to keep going, no matter how difficult things became. I kept my fork down and said nothing. I refused to be the punchline in her backstory, and I certainly would not engage in a ghost battle when the entire room was clapping. Some people in the room looked at me with that subtle, condescending compassion that is saved for has-beens. Medals were affixed as the event progressed, amid laughing, handshakes, champagne glasses clinking, and the reading of tributes. Eventually, the doors were unlocked. A guy clad in wrinkle-resistant dress blues, the same sort worn by those who authorized drone strikes, strode into the room. The Pentagon emblem adorned his shoulders as he swiftly approached to welcome him, after surveying the room with the same decisiveness as if he were still in charge of a battlefield. "Colonel Barrett, sir. I had no idea you were waiting for her to finish." His eyes shifted from her to me as he methodically made his way across the floor, stopped, and saluted. "General Strickland, ma'am," he began, his voice cutting through the din of the audience. "It's been far too long." My father's normally confident expression melted away as every fork froze and heads spun. A voice from the rear murmured, "General, does she truly?" Melody appeared as if someone had just yanked the floor out from under her as she parted her lips to say, "Sir, it's nice to see you again." I nodded slowly in response. While addressing the younger officers on his side, Colonel Barrett remarked, "This woman helped coordinate the withdrawal routes during Operation Hawthorne." And then he pointed to me, saying, "Half of NATO owes her their necks literally." I forced a frown. His words resounded like a beacon in the night sky. And for once, I didn't have to justify my presence. Instead, I could let the quiet speak for itself. Later, as the throng started to rouse again, I broke the hush. An anxious-looking young cadet approached me and asked, "Excuse me, ma'am, are you actually a general?" I leaned in just a little bit, took a slow sip from my glass, which was still the cheap plastic kind, and looked him in the eye. I even gave the order not to fire when protocol said I could because there were children inside the target zone. I chose consequences over casualties. I left the promotion dinner without saying goodbye, hugging, parting remarks, or polite smiles because he didn't answer, and he didn't have to. It was more like a gust of wind crashing through a door that was never meant to open again than a sense of triumph. Icy, harsh, and overwhelmed with unresolved matters, I woke up the next morning to an email in my inbox with a subject line that made my guts turn as I checked my inbox, all while the home was still hushed from the night before. It came from John Arder, a veteran military journalist infamous for publishing the type of secrets that institutions wanted kept hidden, and it was an urgent query regarding the Langi Tigra strategy brief. General Strickland, we have received a classified operations file pertaining to the Langi Tigray campaign, and it contains your name and a summary that suggests you authorized a maneuver that resulted in civilian casualties. We would like your opinion on whether these claims are true or false. I read the message twice, then a third time, and my hands didn't tremble. They were locked because I either knew or thought the file said that the Langi Tigray campaign wasn't a tactical failure. I had contested the intelligence chief's report in a closed-room briefing, but I was the only one who disagreed. It was a baited game, full of falsehoods spun tight by someone who had been playing both sides. Within hours of forwarding the file, Sarah Whiteham called me back and said, "Lena," in a tight voice. The leak came through an old IP address registered to the National Guard Command Center. More specifically, it matches a device issued to Melody 2 years ago. I enlisted her help because there was one woman with a red flag amidst a sea of green lights. When the operation went wrong, I threw myself on the sword to save my team, but now it was back in someone else's hands. I drove to her base without calling or warning and strode in as if I still had power, even though I technically didn't. I found her in the break room, sipping coffee and typing on her phone. The floor moved under me like an avalanche about to fall. Sitting down, I slid a printed trace across the table. "Were you aware that your device was the last one to log into this file?" "I sent it," she continued, her voice harsh. "Last year, I was tired of people whispering about you about how perfect you were, and I was still in your shadow even when you weren't here. I just wanted to erase that." Her gaze jumped from the paper to me and back again, but she didn't deny it. Her jaw clenched. It didn't sting the way betrayals are supposed to. There was no fiery rage, just an emptiness like a room gutted of furniture. I looked at her, not as the officer she'd become, but the sister I once taught to ride a bike, who cried when her knees scraped pavement. "You think I don't know what it feels like to be erased?" I asked quietly. "The difference is, I never tried to erase you." Melody's voice cracked. "I was wrong. I know that now, but people still see you shining. Even when you're gone, I wanted just once to be seen first." We sat in silence, 2 women in uniform, 2 sisters on different sides of a quiet war. Finally, I stood. I didn't come here to reclaim my honor. I said, voice cold but steady, I came to keep the truth from being rewritten, and if anyone thinks I'll let them turn me into a symbol of failure, I leaned in just the right amount so she could sense the gravity of my words. It was obvious they had never taken the time to learn about me. The air in the ancient server room on the edge of the base was perpetually chilly, and it buzzed with the spectral breath of machines that never slept. Sarah had orchestrated our access to the retired data archive, which had been decommissioned but was still operational if someone knew how to tap on it. She showed me a battered keyboard and said, Wraith 07. I gave it a go, typing with my fingers and muscles, and suddenly the screen froze and split open like a long, sealed crypto file retrieval. One folder in particular flashed with a red lock icon. It had been years since I had used this part of myself. I found an audio file in a subfolder labeled Review Only, and Sarah nodded. I opened it and heard a harsh, authoritative voice that I hadn't heard since the tribunal. You'll be my representative and priority. Whatever Langston says, Sector Delta is irrelevant to me. Carry out strike procedure. 5A General Vaughn, in a loud and clear voice, issued an order to modify our targeting criteria without going through the proper channels. This order had already resulted in civilian casualties, and now they were trying to blame me for the misunderstanding. Sarah leaned in and said that if this gets out, he could lose his honors and face prosecution. I nodded, but the air conditioning had stopped cooling the room, and news was already circulating, with journalists asking questions and discovering that someone, Raider perhaps, had tracked the data leak to its original point of entry. Melody's device was now facing a full-blown internal inquiry, suspension, and the possibility of a dishonorable discharge. I knew what to do, so I strode into the guard counsel's office wearing my old service coat with the medals tucked inside my breast pocket like ghosts. I calmly explained that I was investigating an anomaly in the Langy Tray logs and gave Captain Strickland the order to reaccess the file. Any breach in protocol was her doing, and she listened to my request, maintaining silence. I returned to my temporary office at the Strategic Academy that night to find something off. The edge of the door had fresh pry marks. I cautiously stepped inside, but nothing seemed out of place. Then I reached for my drawer and saw that the USB with Van's voice on it had disappeared. Instead, I found a note on my desk with one line in block print, but no signature. I guess you're the only one who remembers how war works. I hadn't seen that seal in 10 years. I emailed Sarah, but she didn't respond. At the bottom was a red ink stamp of an eagle holding arrows, a sign used by an off-book unit under the Department of Defense that was formally disbanded after Langy Tigre. Security logs said she'd left the base just after 11 p.m. and never returned. No confirmed sightings since disappeared like fog and moonlight. I sat in silence. The room dark except for the glowing map on my wall. No explosions marked no troop movements, just borders. Politics, shifting alliances, a new battlefield. And I understood something. Then this wasn't a war of soldiers anymore. This was a war of whispers, of truths buried beneath headlines of reputations turned into currency. But this time, I wouldn't play dead. Not because I was scared, but because someone somewhere still believed in the story. I hadn't yet told the door to my office at the Strategic Academy had been sealed shut with a dull gray tape and an embossed federal tag. Reading temporarily sealed security protocol violation, it hung there like an accusation dressed in bureaucracy. I didn't need anyone to explain what it meant in this town. Investigation pending was just another way to put your legacy in a freezer until it stopped breathing. I didn't bother trying to plead or demand. I stood for a few seconds just staring at that door like it was a casket with my name on it. Then I turned and walked. My phone buzzed unlisted. I hesitated. Then answered General Strickland. The voice draw, smooth, calculated, unmistakably. Male, been a while, I hear you're still playing by the rules. I said nothing. He chuckled. Some things aren't meant to be dug up. I'm offering you a chance, you back off. We forget this little noise. You keep your safety, maybe even a bit of your name. I hung up without a word. I didn't need confirmation. It was Vaughn by noon. My friend Melody walked there, and her eyes had that same old fire in them that I hadn't seen since we were kids, going onto roofs to make ourselves feel taller. I found something. she started before I could respond. You're on suspension, I reminded her. She nodded, and I figured that meant she had time. I went into the audit logs and checked the guard systems. There, I discovered the IP address that erased Van's voice file backup. I stared. You could be permanently discharged for that. I erased you once, Lena, she continued with tight teeth. I won't let them do it again. I didn't hug her, I just looked away because if I did hug her, I might break. The following night, as the wind shook the weathered structure of my temporary office, an encrypted email appeared on my screen. The address was jumbled, but the message was brief. I'm alive. They're holding me at the old communications post south of Fort Hamilton. I have the data sticks. The runner is the key. But there was no signature. I knew it was Sarah. I sent a secure ping to Barrett, my oldest contact from the Special Analysis Command. If anyone could get to that corner without setting off any tripwires, it would have been him. And then there was Ethan, who had a knack for showing up at the wrong moments and listening to the right things. He found Melody and me in the parking garage, reviewing the IP log. He didn't interrupt or get scared, he just stood there until we noticed him. Then, as calmly as if we were discussing course curriculum, he asked, Ma'am, do you think sometimes honesty needs as much planning as a strike-up? I studied him every time I said, but only when you believe victory isn't worth your soul. He gave a slow nod, then walked away. That boy was going to make a fine officer if the system didn't eat him alive first, just before midnight. Another alert hit my inbox. Internal security reports flagged a military intelligence summit, scheduled at Arlington in 3 days. Confirmed attendees international delegates, high-level brass and General Marcus Vaugh. I knew what that meant. Vaughn wasn't just attending for diplomacy. He was attending to control the narrative. If there were still shreds of evidence floating in the dark, he'd make sure they burned under fluorescent lights and diplomatic smiles. He'd show up with speeches, photo ops, and 100 eyes watching the surface, while beneath it all, the truth would be cleaned out like an old wound sewn shut without disinfectant. I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking like a dare I was out of time and out of hiding, and the war I'd been trying to leave behind it just RSVP from the top floor of the academy. I watched cadets move across the training field, like chess pieces calculated precise, unaware they were being watched. Each boot print reminded me of who I used to be and what I still could be if I stopped hiding behind the ghost of my service teaching had kept me sane, but it wasn't enough anymore. Not if I still let the truth rot in the dark. Barrington sent me a file containing a tactical plan to breach the military summit at Arlington. The plan included a light-manned rear access area, a hidden AV uplink, and a defunct signal box. It wasn't a foolproof plan, but as any soldier knows, no plan survives contact with the enemy. Regardless, before I could finish the briefing, Melody volunteered herself, saying, "Let me be the insider." She went on to say, "They know I've been under review, so it wouldn't be strange if I showed up asking for reinstatement." "I will wear the badge, Mike. I want to do this right," she said after a little pause. I hesitated the last time she tried to fix something. We nearly lost everything, but this time she was clear-eyed. She wasn't doing this to erase me. She was trying to bring me back at 1600 hours. She entered through the south gate in a plain uniform. The device was tucked under her ID badge, hidden in plain sight. I monitored the uplink from a van parked 3 blocks down my fingers, hovering over the trigger switch inside. Melody approached Vaughn, who stood mid-circle with other brass. He looked tired, grayer, but still dangerous, General Strickland. He said into the air as if speaking to a ghost, "You always had a knack for surviving storms you shouldn't have weathered. Then you look into Melody's eyes and see why your sister and those like her are deadly." I supplied that mission incorrect information because they prioritize justice over logistics. I leaped out of the van, ripped cables, rerouted power, and Ethan was already at the relay box, prying it open. A shadow darted out from the lot, and a single shot cracked the air. He stumbled and hit his shoulder. I caught him before he hit the ground. Blood seeped through his sleeve, but he gritted his teeth and whispered, "Don't let them win with silence." As a witness, my name is Lena Strickland. I was once told I was nobody, but today I carry a truth. When power manipulates records, soldiers die following unverified orders. I ran back to the van, reinitiated the backup feed, and stood staring into the tiny microphone. But now my mind was racing. and my hands were moving impulsively. This wasn't about reputations anymore. Remaining silent is not a strategy, but rather an act of complicity. Inside the summit, the feed-held voice of the van resounded once more, this time without interruption. No one smiled or yelled as they led Melody and me down a back corridor to a stark meeting room, the type with fluorescent lights but no humanity. There were no names or explanations, just chairs, a table, and an increasing stillness thick with purpose. Vaughn entered the room with an air of dignity, but his hands betrayed him with their tight grip and pulsating fingers. His uniform gleamed with the over-decoration of a politician's campaign poster. He had abandoned his role as a mentor and had transformed into the wolf. Now that we were in his den, he offered us peace as he began a dignified retirement. You stand on the margins of history, your cadets unharmed, and your family free to roam. I didn't blink. You still don't get it. I fought for something, not a legacy. You can't buy dignity. He roared with laughter as the door swung open, letting Ethan in first, his arm in a sling but his eyes blazing. Sarah, behind them, stood pale and frail but unbroken, taking a dandy from her coat and delicately setting it on the table, as if it were an offering or a grenade full of logs. According to her, there have been instances of audio backups related to African humanitarian funds being diverted or manipulated. Melody swiftly stepped between the two, her stubborn gaze meeting the unwavering resolve of the van. I was afraid of you once, she said, but not anymore. I took an oath of honor, not blind loyalty. Despite the van's aggressive advance, Melody managed to keep her hand from hitting the drive. When the security forces stormed in, they weren't after us. They were after him. Vaughn finally grasped the meaning of losing an unprepared war. As we were leaving, a nurse stopped me. Ethan had collapsed from internal bleeding. They stabilized him just in time, but he would need weeks to recover. I stood at the intensive care unit window, watching him breathe through all the plastic and wire. The nurse whispered, "You're not trained for this." I responded, but he understood better than most. She reminded me that bravery isn't measured in medals, but in the choices you make. Returned to the academy, not because I lacked the strength to rise again, but because I finally had the strength to lead others forward, and this time I wouldn't be silent. The headlines spread faster than I expected across military news sites and mainstream outlets. Days later, the Pentagon reached out, offering me reinstatement, a strategic command seat with power and prestige. I turned it down. I'd climbed the ladder once, known the view and the silence that lived at the top. Van's name was prominently featured in the news when General Marcus Vaughn was arrested for charges of embezzlement, intelligence manipulation, and evidence tampering pertaining to the Langi Tigra operation. However, I was relieved that my name was not included in the chain of shame that followed General Vaughn's for the first time in years. Instead of being cast as the scapegoat, my role as the whistleblower, General Lena Strickland, was recognized as crucial in uncovering the DoD cover-up was acknowledged. While this did not feel like redemption, it was like a slight relief. The summons for an internal hearing was then held to clarify roles and motivations. Before me, in the chair of the panel, sat the same individuals who, years ago, ignored my warnings like static, and even pretended not to remember that I didn't dress for the occasion, didn't wear ribbons, and told it like it was. I didn't intend to become a martyr, but I will never apologize for upsetting a peace that was established through deceit. Complete reinstatement of my rank and honors, and exclusion from punishment for internal disclosure in accordance with public integrity standards. Melody formally reprimanded but retained in active service. We walked out of that room together, not as the flawless daughters our parents once imagined, but as whole ones later. I returned to the house. I hadn't stepped inside in nearly a decade. My childhood home on the hallway shelf was a photograph of me in uniform, once removed, now returned, placed beside Melody's graduation photo, a quiet rebalancing of memory. My mother stood nearby. No tears, no excuses. I never knew. Love could be that silent. She said, her voice breaking, and that cruel. I nodded. I'm not here to blame. I'm here to lay it down. My father, who'd barely spoken to me since my discharge, handed me a wooden box inside a letter, dated 3 weeks after I left active duty. His handwriting never sent. I didn't know how to say I was still proud. I didn't know if you'd want to hear it. I didn't read it. They just tucked it into my jacket close to my chest where it belonged back at the academy. A new photo was pinned to the bulletin board outside the cadet. Messme Ethan and a handful of young officers, smiling arms, linked no hierarchy beneath it. Someone had scrolled in thick marker, "She didn't fight for attention. She fought for attention to the truth." And that's when I realized legacy isn't built by medals. It's carried in the lessons people choose to remember. I walked into the lecture hall the next morning. No insignia on my collar, no spotlight, just a whiteboard and a room full of minds ready to think beyond drills and doctrine. "This isn't a class about war," I began. "It's a class about what happens after the battles, when silence becomes more dangerous than gunfire, and when truth gets auctioned off to the highest bidder." I looked across their faces today. We learn how to win and still walk away with our soul. Time moves slower when you're not trying to outrun it each morning. I brewed coffee in the academy's tiny staff kitchen and watched sunlight stretch across the whiteboard in my classroom. I heard the rhythmic footfalls of cadets echoing in the corridor like the steady heartbeat of a place still learning how to breathe. There were no ovations, no applause, just continuity and peace. However fragile, one morning, as I was writing 2 words moral intelligence on the board, Ethan walked in his arms still in a sling. His pace deliberate, he said nothing, just nodded and took his seat at the front after class. I found a folded note on his desk. It read, "I used to think courage was a loud scream. Now I know it's the quiet truth spoken when no one's listening." I stood holding that note longer than I needed to. Because that truth, that was everything I had once forgotten. Melody didn't go back to her post at the National Guard. She declined the offer of reinstatement. Instead, she joined a civilian intelligence watchdog unit. Small, independent, and underfunded, but with one hell of a mission to investigate abuses from within the system. Why, I asked. One afternoon, she smiled because if anyone knows what it feels like to be betrayed by the very thing you served, it's me, and I couldn't argue with that. A month later, we went together to the old base, where I once commanded. The command building had been repainted. My name had long been stripped from the roster, but beneath a withered chestnut tree behind the parade yard, we placed a small plaque. No name, no rank. Just these words for those who died unnamed, but never unnoticed. We didn't say much. Grief shared in truth doesn't need language. It lives in the silence between breaths. A message illuminated my secure line the night prior to my last term speech. Anonymous, with only a few words to describe Lena. "The defenses haven't stopped crumbling, but now they know you're not alone. I may not have saved the sender, but I did preserve the sensation of being erased from history and now being the catalyst for someone to rewrite it." That morning, as I entered the lecture hall, the door closed softly behind me, enclosing a sacred silence. Stands of people staring up at the ceiling, hoping to make a connection rather than receive instructions. I began by telling a narrative rather than reciting policy or tactics. Here's a story about a woman who refused to accept being silenced. She fought for the right to be named, not for glory or applause, but for the courage to name what matters. I said that you won't always be believed, but that you should live in such a way that when the truth rises, it calls you first. Sometimes, the loudest victories come in silence, the kind that doesn't make headlines but heals the soul. Truth doesn't always roar, but sometimes it simply refuses to be buried. When you choose to rise not for applause but for integrity, you become unshakable. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Drop a comment, subscribe, or share it with someone who needs to know they're not alone. Thank you, and until next time, stay grounded in your truth.